Welcome to Study Watch.
Today we're really diving into something fascinating, trying to grasp the complexities of global markets and all the cultural nuances that really make them tick.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, right? Like drinking from a fire hose sometimes when you start thinking about the scale and the differences in how business is done around the world.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to kind of distill things down, pull out the most important insights from a mountain of information, everything from demographic data to, the motivations behind globalization, even delve into some really interesting cultural frameworks and talk about how branding has to adapt when crossing borders.
It's a big picture view, but with an emphasis on the practical stuff,
Yeah.
what really matters when you're engaging with a global marketplace. And honestly, some of the less obvious things that can trip people up, those surprising elements that are super critical to success.
Yeah, and I think that's what people really come to the deep dive for, that deeper level of understanding.
Yeah.
So let's start with something really fundamental, kind of setting the stage. Global population. We're talking about 8 billion people on this planet, roughly.
Huge number, right. And when you start thinking about potential markets, the concentration of that population is really striking.
It is.
Think about China and India, each with about 1.4 billion people.
Oh, wow.
So those two countries alone represent about 35% of the entire global population. It's not just about scale, it's about the efficiency of reaching such a concentrated market. If you really understand those two cultures well, you've got access to a consumer base larger than the entire developed world. That's mind-blowing.
Right. For perspective, here in the U.S., we have about 328 million people, roughly 5% of the global total. So that difference in sheer numbers really hits home when we think about potential market size.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of leads to the obvious question, why do companies even bother going global in the first place? With all the complexities involved, it's got to be a good reason.
Well, one big driver is, market saturation in developed countries. Companies hit a ceiling in terms of growth within their own borders. They reach a certain level, and then they're looking for new opportunities.
It's like, they've climbed one mountain, and now they see another one in the distance beckoning them.
Right, exactly. And emerging markets become really, really attractive in that scenario. Countries like India, China, but also Brazil, Vietnam, places experiencing a rapid expansion of their middle class.
Yeah, and that's where the real potential lies. With more people entering the middle class, you have increased potential for sales and revenue. Their purchasing power changes too. They move from basic necessities to having more disposable income.
Makes sense. If you've already got a successful product or technology, why not tap into these new markets? Leverage what you already have.
Exactly. You've already missed the investment. And of course, we can't forget about the role of the internet and e-commerce.
Right.
They've really lowered the barriers to entry for companies wanting to go global.
Totally. So we've talked about developed and emerging markets, but what are the key things that really set them apart, the defining characteristics?
Well, in developed markets, you generally have mature economies with established infrastructure, think transportation, communication networks. They have robust financial systems, stable currencies, and their legal frameworks are sophisticated. Businesses have a lot of experience and resources.
So in emerging markets, those things are still under development, right? Still in the process of being built up.
Right, but they're undergoing a significant shift. Their populations are often moving away from, say, agricultural labor and into more skilled employment. That's a huge economic shift.
And what about economic growth? I imagine the trajectory is pretty different between the two.
Yeah, GDP growth rates are something that economists and business strategists watch very closely. Emerging economies tend to grow at a much faster pace than developed ones. That's a big part of what makes them so attractive.
Makes sense. Which brings us back to the expanding middle class and emerging economies. They are you mentioned this earlier, the backbone.
Oh yeah, the backbone of the economy. They have enough income to not just cover their basic needs, but also have that disposable income. That's what drives economic growth, consumer spending, all of that.
So as these developing economies experience GDP growth, their middle class expands, while in more mature markets, that middle class stays relatively stable.
Yeah, and the projections for middle class growth are huge. Some forecasts say the global middle class could reach 5.3 billion people by 2030. Even more conservative estimates from the Brookings Institute put it at 4.8 billion.
Wow. That's a lot of new consumers with spending power. And I imagine that growth isn't evenly distributed around the world.
No, not at all. It's concentrated in a few key places.
Yeah.
China and India, they're the engines driving this expansion. Their middle classes are growing about 12 times faster than in developed countries.
12 times. That's incredible. Do we have a real-world example of what that kind of growth potential looks like?
Oh yeah. Let's look at the auto market in 2018. China sold a whopping 23.7 million cars that year. Compare that to 5.3 million in the US and 3.4 million in Germany. China actually sold more cars than the US, Japan, and India combined. Talk about market potential.
Yeah, that really paints a picture. So let's say a company decides to go global. How do they even begin to figure out which markets to enter? It's a big decision.
Oh, for sure. They usually start by analyzing the external environment of potential markets, looking at the big picture. They might use frameworks like SWOT analysis.
SWOT, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Exactly. Or PEST analysis, which looks at the political, economic, social, and technological landscape of a market.
Yeah.
And within those social factors, culture is absolutely critical.
He's gotta be.
Understanding the culture is essential, not just for successful marketing, but also for navigating different ethnic subcultures within a single country. Even within the same country, you can have huge cultural variations.
Right. So that brings us to the importance of respecting other cultures. What does that actually mean in a practical sense, especially in a business context?
It's more than just, being polite. It's about truly understanding and respecting the local customs, values, religions, and communication styles. We've seen even prominent figures, people like George Bush, Obama, Angelina Jolie, even the British royal family, navigating these cultural differences on the world stage.
Yeah, those high-profile examples definitely highlight the importance of cultural sensitivity.
For sure.
So when we talk about culture, what are some of the fundamental elements that we should be aware of?
One big one is social structures, the way a society categorizes and ranks its members, based on things like race, wealth, ethnicity, occupation. These groupings often come with different levels of access to resources and privilege.
And those rankings aren't always easy to change, are they?
Right. That's where social mobility comes in. The ability to move up or down the social ladder. In some cultures, it's very rigid, like the caste system in India.
Can you talk a little bit more about the caste system?
Yeah, so it originated about 3,000 years ago and was based on Hindu religious texts. It's this hierarchical system where people are born into a certain caste, and it determines their social status, their occupation, even who they can marry. And at the very bottom, you have the Dalits, or the untouchables, who face a lot of discrimination.
It's hard to believe something like that still exists.
Well, officially it was outlawed in India back in 1950, but its effects still linger, even within diaspora communities.
Diaspora communities meaning?
Communities of people who have emigrated from their original homeland. And there's growing awareness of these issues. Just recently, U.S. cities like Seattle and Fresno banned caste-based discrimination.
It's a reminder that these social structures can be deeply ingrained and even transcend geographical boundaries. Now, I know our sources also mentioned something about PISA scores. How do they fit into all of this?
Yeah. PISA, or the Program for International Student Assessment, is a global study. It compares how 15-year-old students in different countries perform in math, reading, and science.
So it doesn't directly measure social structures.
Right. It's more about educational outcomes. But those outcomes can reflect societal priorities. For example, in 2022, the U.S. ranked 16th in math, 9th in reading, and 34th in science.
Wow. Okay, so moving on to something more interpersonal, something we all experience. Greetings and communication styles. It seems like something so simple could be a potential cultural minefield.
Oh yeah, first impressions matter, right? And different cultures have very different ways of greeting each other. Think about the French president kissing the German chancellor on the cheek versus the very formal business card exchange in Japan. Totally different vibes.
Very different. And then there's the whole concept of high context versus low context communication. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, it's all about how much unspoken information is involved in communication. In high context cultures, you have places like the Middle East, Japan, a lot of Asian countries. There, the message isn't always stated directly. You have to pay attention to nonverbal cues, tone of voice, facial expressions, all that. Building trust and relationships over time is super important.
So you're saying you have to kind of read between the lines.
Exactly. Now, in low-context cultures, like the US or Australia, people are much more direct. They say what they mean, and the goal is to get information across quickly and efficiently. It's interesting, too, how high-context cultures tend to be more collectivist, where people have strong ties to their communities, whereas low-context cultures are often more ethnically diverse. like here in the US.
That connection between high context and collectivism and low context and diversity is fascinating. It's not something I'd really thought about before. Now, of course, when we're talking about cultural differences, we can't ignore Geert Hofstede. His work is considered foundational in this field.
Absolutely. Professor Hofstede was a Dutch social psychologist. He came up with one of the most widely used models for understanding different dimensions of national culture.
And his model has, 6 dimensions?
Yes, 6. They are Power Distance Index, PDI, Individualism versus Collectivism, Masculinity versus Femininity, Uncertainty Avoidance Index, UAI, Long-Term versus Short-Term Orientation, and Indulgence versus Restraint. Each country gets a score on a scale from 0 to 120 for each dimension.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Let's break it down, starting with PDI.
All right. Power Distance Index measures how comfortable people are with unequal power distribution. In high power distance cultures, hierarchy is accepted, and people generally defer to authority figures. Decisions are made at the top. On the other hand, in low power distance cultures, you see more egalitarian approaches, where people expect to have a say, and organizational structures tend to be flatter.
So it's about who holds the power and how that power is perceived. What about individualism versus collectivism? We touched on that a bit earlier with communication styles.
Right, so this dimension looks at whether a culture prioritizes individual freedom and achievement or group harmony and well-being. Individualistic cultures, they emphasize the I over the we. People take care of themselves and their immediate families. Hiring and promotions are based on individual merit. But in collectivist cultures, the group comes first. They value things like loyalty, harmony, and seniority. It's fascinating, though, that most of the world, like 70–80%, leans towards collectivism. Asia, Africa, Latin America, they mostly fall into this category. And then you have more individualistic cultures like the UK, US, Australia. Even the roots of individualism are interesting. They can be traced back to the British aristocracy in the 15th century and then spread through colonization.
That historical context is really eye-opening. Now, what about masculinity versus femininity? I know the terminology can feel a bit outdated, but what's the concept here?
I know, right? It's not about being male or female. In Hofstede's model, masculinity, a high score represents a culture that values material success, achievement, heroism, assertiveness. It's more competitive.
Yeah.
Femininity is the opposite. It's about caring for others, quality of life, cooperation. The US, for example, often displays a combo of individualism and masculinity, with our emphasis on winning and being the best.
Yeah.
You see it in advertising all the time.
Yeah, like those slogans, be the first, be the best, it's everywhere. Okay, what about Uncertainty Avoidance Index, or UAI?
UAI basically measures how comfortable people are with ambiguity and risk. High UAI cultures, they don't like uncertainty. They want structure, clear rules, experts to guide them. Bureaucracy often thrives in these cultures, but low UAI cultures are more comfortable with risk, more adaptable to change. Greece, with a very high UAI, is often used as an example of high bureaucracy. In contrast, Scandinavia, with a low UAI, tends to have less bureaucracy and more innovation.
Okay, so high UAI, more risk-averse, more rules. Low UAI, more comfortable with change, more adaptable.
Right.
Makes sense. Now, long-term versus short-term orientation seems pretty self-explanatory.
It generally is. Long-term oriented cultures value things like perseverance, thrift, saving for the future. Education is also super important. They're more pragmatic, adaptable. Confucian philosophy plays a big role in shaping this orientation. Avoiding losing face is a big deal in these cultures. Short-term oriented cultures are more focused on immediate results, tradition, and maybe less willing to adapt to change.
And finally, indulgence versus restraint.
This dimension looks at how much a culture allows people to enjoy life and have fun versus suppressing those desires through strict social norms. High indulgence societies are more laid back, they value leisure time, they spend more freely. Low indulgence or high restraint societies have stricter social norms, and people might feel guilty about indulging themselves.
So these 6 dimensions really provide a framework for understanding cultural differences. But how do you actually apply this in the real world, especially when doing business globally?
That's where the concept of cultural distance comes in. It basically measures how different two cultures are. Hofstede's model helps us visualize this distance by comparing scores on each dimension. You can literally see how far apart two cultures are on these values. There's also something called the G-Lobe analysis, which is a bit more comprehensive. It compares management styles and perspectives across different cultures and can help identify areas where cross-cultural training might be needed.
So knowing these cultural dimensions is crucial when adapting products and marketing messages for global markets. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation, is it?
No, definitely not. Even branding itself has a fascinating history. It goes back to ancient times, like stonemasons and trade guilds marking their goods. And over time, brands accumulate associations in consumers' minds. Everything contributes to the brand image. The name, the logo, even jingles, characters, all of it.
And most companies manage more than just one brand, don't they? They have portfolios.
Exactly. A brand portfolio includes all the brands a company owns. Think about companies like Nestle. They have thousands of brands. Or Procter & Gamble, Unilever, they have hundreds. Even specific industries like beauty are dominated by a few major companies with massive portfolios. They cater to different consumer segments based on culture, age, gender, income level. Take Coty owning Kylie Cosmetics, for example, or how Hilton has different hotel brands for different types of travelers.
And even within a single brand, there can be a lot of product variation.
Right. That's called product line depth. The more items you have within a product line, the wider your appeal. You attract different preferences, build a perception of quality, even achieve economies of scale. Think about Tide detergent, all the different formulations and types they have. Or the Japanese brand GRCY. They specifically target busy women over 40 with their makeup products.
But managing all those brands and product lines must be challenging. How do companies do it?
It is a challenge. One big one is avoiding brand overlap, where your own brands end up competing with each other. Companies constantly evaluate their portfolios, looking at the performance of each brand and product line. They might even cut underperforming brands. Procter & Gamble did that a few years ago, eliminating over 100 brands to focus on their most profitable ones.
So streamlining the portfolio to maximize profit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a well-managed brand portfolio has a lot of advantages. It allows you to reach different market segments, work with various retailers, achieve economies of scale, even diversify your risk.
It's like a carefully orchestrated symphony of brands.
Kind of, yeah. And then comes the big question. When introducing a product globally, do you standardize it, keeping it the same everywhere, or do you adapt it to local markets?
It's a tough choice.
It is. Global standardization has its advantages, especially for certain products. You save money on manufacturing, packaging, advertising. Think luxury goods, they maintain a consistent global image. Or industrial products like John Deere equipment used similarly across different industries. Even basic commodity products can benefit from standardization. And with China's rising influence in the luxury market, that standardized approach is really paying off.
But there must be strong reasons to adapt products and messages as well, right?
Oh, definitely. Consumer preferences, especially for food and beverages, can vary wildly from culture to culture. Cultural differences, religious beliefs, even the competitive landscape can force your hand. Different countries have different environmental conditions, different regulations, different income levels. Everything plays a role. Adaptation can be more expensive, but it makes your product more relevant and increases its chances of success.
Do we have any real-world examples of companies adapting their products?
Plenty. Kraft, for instance, had to adjust their cookie recipes for China. They were too sweet for the local palate. Domino's Pizza actually failed in Italy because their American-style pizza just wasn't authentic enough. But they succeeded in India by adding a ton of vegetarian options. Even Red Bull, a global brand, adapts their packaging for different markets while keeping the core formula the same. Think about how rice cookers differ between Japan and the West, or how Coca-Cola introduced smaller, cheaper bottles in India to reach more consumers. And then there are climate considerations. You need ruggedized products for certain regions.
So sometimes you even have to adapt based on the environment. What about message adaptation?
Equally important. Procter & Gamble had a detergent called Cheer, and it flopped in Japan because they focused on its effectiveness at all temperatures. But the Japanese mostly wash clothes in cold water. The message didn't resonate. Even the Aflac Duck, a successful ad campaign in the US, didn't work as well in Japan. Humor doesn't always translate.
Right. And speaking of perceptions, what about country of origin, or COO? How does that factor into things?
COO is all about how people's perceptions of a country influence their views on products from that country. You know, German engineering implies quality. Italian style means fashion and luxury. French is associated with sophistication. Japanese with high-tech electronics. Dr. Oetker, a German company, uses Italian imagery in their pizza ads to leverage that association with Italian pizza. But COO can also hurt. Russian vodka took a hit after the Ukraine invasion, and even non-Russian brands with Russian-sounding names suffered. Brands like Stoli had to really emphasize their Latvian origin to counter those negative perceptions.
It's fascinating how intertwined all these factors are. Now let's shift our focus to subcultures within a country. What exactly are subcultures and why do they matter so much to marketers?
Basically, subcultures are distinct groups within a larger society. They might be based on ethnicity, age, religion, lifestyle, or even shared interests. In the US, you have subcultures based on gender, geography, generations like baby boomers or Gen Z, religion, ethnicity. Marketers need to understand these groups because it allows them to tailor their messages, develop specific products, even choose the right media channels.
Can you give me some examples of these interest-based subcultures?
Oh, sure. There are the eclipse chasers who travel the world to see solar eclipses. The gaming subculture is huge with its own platforms like Twitch. You have fan subcultures like Trekkies or Swifties, super passionate about Star Trek or Taylor Swift. Even cosplay and anime have dedicated communities, so much so that Singer released a special cosplay edition sewing machine.
It's amazing how these shared interests can bring people together. What about categorizing male and female subcultures? Isn't that a bit too broad?
It is broad, yeah, but it's about understanding how cultures define and express sex roles, those behaviors and expectations for men and women. These roles are learned, and they vary from culture to culture. Sometimes this leads to things like gender-based pricing or the pink tax products marketed to women being more expensive than similar products for men. There are actually legal efforts to eliminate this practice.
Wow, I hadn't really thought about the pink tax before, but it makes sense.
And then there's the interesting idea that, those traditional anthropological roles, the hunter and the gatherer, might still influence shopping behaviors today. Women might be more inclined to browse and explore, while men are more task-oriented. Paco Underhill, he observed these differences in his research.
It's like those gender roles are still subtly influencing our behavior. And we can't forget about geography. The regional differences in a country like the US are huge.
For sure. Different cultures, climates, histories, resources, they all shape consumer behavior and even political leanings. The 9 Nations of North America theory is interesting. It divides the continent into 9 cultural regions, not based on state borders, but on shared values and lifestyles.
Right, and we should touch on the LGBTQ plus subculture as well, which is becoming more and more visible and influential.
Absolutely. The percentage of LGBTQ plus adults in the US has been rising, especially among Gen Z. It's a large and diverse consumer market.
For sure. Finally, let's talk about generational subcultures. Every generation is shaped by the events they experience.
Exactly. Understanding those formative experiences, whether it's the Great Depression or the rise of the internet, is crucial for marketers and employers. And then, of course, there are religious subcultures which influence daily life and the growing diversity of ethnic subcultures within the US. It's a complex and ever-evolving landscape.
It is. So much information. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to recognize the sheer vastness and diversity of global markets and how vital it is to understand different cultures. Frameworks like Hofstede's model give us a way to analyze those differences. And when going global, the decision to standardize or adapt your products and messages is crucial.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day, think about your own cross-cultural interactions or products you encounter that are marketed globally. How might the things we talked about today influence future business trends and even your personal consumer experiences? It's definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.